Well, I need my Testament, would you? That's pretty bad when a soldier gets into the war without his sword. I guess I was thinking about the song we were singing. And this prayer that the thing said by the speaker will make impressions that will go with us to our home. And if you sang that song and truly determined to follow Jesus, though none go with you, no turning back, then we can all go home and be blessed. But I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak to you too. I have especially appreciated the opportunity not only to speak myself, but to hear my brother speak. I've just thought that in the meetings last year and this year, I've heard him speak more than I have been able to hear him in a number of years put together. And it's a delight. I've enjoyed it and been blessed by it, as I know others have who've been here. I was thinking about another thing as well, and that is how many wonderful people serving the Lord in other places trace their roots back to Pleasant Grove. I know churches in Birmingham that are blessed, as well as Atlanta and other places. And we can rejoice in that, but we mustn't just rejoice in the past. And I'm glad to see the interest, the life that still exists in this congregation, though not maybe as many younger people as there used to be. They've gone to bless other places. And our concern and interest is in the kingdom, not just in building up some one local congregation. May God bless our meeting and all the other efforts that you make to advance the kingdom of God in this area and wherever your individuals may go. I've taken the liberty again tonight to change the topic. We've been talking about the special people of God. We've seen who they are. We've seen the beginning of what's called the church, which is a called out group of those who love the Lord and want to be obedient to his will. And we've talked about the church as a family. There are three different expressions or descriptions in the New Testament of assemblies in which God was worshiped. And I believe there's value in making some comparisons regarding these, as well as showing some differences that existed among them. These, of course, are the temple and the synagogue and the church. Two of these dominated in the lifetime of Jesus. The church was established after Jesus went back to heaven. But while he lived, of course, there was the temple. And this is an architect's idea of what the temple looked like in the days of Jesus. That was actually the third temple that had existed on that location. The first was built by Solomon, and it must have been a remarkable building. I read some time ago when I was looking at the building of the temple and saw that there was 3,750 tons of gold that went into that temple, and more than that of silver. It's just hard to imagine that much. There's not a building anywhere existing in the world today that would have been as expensive as that building was. But of course, the people did not respect it. They even went so far as to worship idols in the temple sanctuaries. And so God left that temple, and the Babylonians destroyed it. Years after they returned, they built a second temple. And because the population was less and wealth did not exist as it had, the people were relatively poor. The building was nowhere as extravagant, though it certainly was an important building for them. But several years before Jesus was born, Herod, as he's called the Great, came to the throne and ruled in that part of the world. And he was a tremendous builder. His buildings were known throughout the world. But he enlarged the platform of the temple and made it into a very beautiful structure. And someone who lived then said, "He who has not seen the temple does not know beauty." It said that it was from a distance. You could see it glowing as a jewel. This was the temple in which Jesus worked and taught. Now, I want to stress the fact that Jesus did not actually teach in the temple building. Jesus could not even go into the temple building. This is a little circle showing an individual, which helps you to understand how large it was. Jews only could go into this area that I've indicated here, but only the priests could go into the other building. God, and this is maybe a little bit of a footnote, but God has assigned roles all through the centuries. And he assigned the priests of the tribe of Levi to serve in the temple building. Jesus could not do that. Caiaphas was the high priest, and he could go in there, but Jesus could not go in that building. That didn't mean that Caiaphas was better than Jesus, or that Jesus was inferior to Caiaphas by any means. It was just that it was the role of the priest to serve in the temple building, and it was not the role of those from the tribe of Judah to do so. And you don't find Jesus out protesting that he couldn't go into that building, saying, "I'm equal to anybody else." Actually, there was a gentleman by the name of Korah who made that kind of claim, and it didn't go well for him and his people. And later on, King Uzziah went into the temple to offer incense, and he was struck with leprosy. That just was not the place for a person of Judah. And if I can make an application of that, God has assigned certain roles even today. Men are to be the leaders. Men are to do the public speaking in the church. Women are forbidden to that. Women, on the other hand, are to give birth to children. And what a blessing that can be. That's something man can't do at all. There's no way he can do it. God has given areas in which we can serve. That doesn't mean one area is superior to the other, or that the people who do not have those assignments are inferior. It just means those are the roles that God has given. And we need to learn that in very, very important lesson. People from all over the world, by God's decree, came to this temple for worship. Once again, not in the major building, but in the temple courts where Jews could go, and even Gentiles were allowed in portions of that very large courtyard. But in addition to the temple, we read quite a lot about the synagogues. When the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians and the people were carried away into Babylon, they felt a need to get together and remind themselves of the teaching of the law, to pray to God, and to instruct the young in the ways of the Lord. And so they began to gather. And wherever there were 10 families, they could build a synagogue. The building was not at first of importance, but really the word means assembly. It's actually identical to the word that is translated church. It means the same thing. But eventually the synagogue as an assembly was a word that was used to describe the building that they would build. But those buildings were very simple compared to the temple. You can make a comparison with the people there in front of that synagogue and see how small it was compared to the synagogue, to the temple, which was so large and so ornate. These were differences between the temple and the synagogue. But let's look just a little closer at that. There was only one temple, and it was the center of Judaism for the whole wide world. It was in Jerusalem, where God had placed his name. The building was, as we've already seen, as ornate as the people could provide, and was known throughout the world for its extravagance. There were high priests, common priests, and then people that were not priests at all. There was a distinction between the clergy and the laity, if you please. The priests had holy garments that were prescribed by the law, beautiful, expensive garments that they were to wear under certain circumstances, and then plain, simple clothes under other circumstances, but all of them holy because they were prescribed by the Lord. Animal sacrifices were made every morning and every evening, and then numerous sacrifices for various occasions. On one occasion, 120,000 animals sacrificed at one time. There was incense that was offered inside the temple, there in the holy place where the altar of incense was, so that the aroma of the incense would go back into the most holy place, which represented the presence of God. There was a candlestick to give light. In fact, more than one in the temple, of course, one in the tabernacle. There was a laver in which the priests were to wash their feet and their hands, not the whole body, but their feet and their hands when they went into the temple. They had instruments of music, trumpets and lyres and other instruments that were said to have been invented by David, but God ordained them. God approved them for the temple. And there was holy water, which was prescribed again by the law, exactly what was to be involved in the putting together or the gathering together this holy water. In contrast, in the synagogue, there were many synagogues. Every community, as we've said, where there were 10 Jewish families, could have a synagogue. And they were absolutely independent. I've done some study to try to find some indication of a central authority that might control the synagogues. And I haven't found any indication of any. The people who formed the synagogue were in a sense responsible for that particular synagogue. They were autonomous and independent. The buildings were very simple structures as a rule. There were a few that were built with foreign money, actually. You remember that on one occasion the people said the centurion had built them a synagogue, and it perhaps was a little more elaborate. But many of them were the kind that I have shown you in the previous picture, put together by relatively poor people as a place where they could meet for worship. The synagogues had elders and deacons. Sometimes you read about the rulers of the synagogue, but those were elders. And there were deacons who were responsible for the building and for the keeping of the law, the books of the law, the arks that were provided. And these were the officers of the synagogue. There were no holy garments at all, no clergy and laity. The elders of the synagogue and the deacons were just drawn from the people who made up the synagogue. There were no animal sacrifices. There was no incense. There was primarily the reading of the law and an explanation of what the law said. And there were no instruments of music, and certainly there was no holy water in the synagogues. So you can see the contrast between the temple and the synagogue. The synagogues were very valuable. In a community, to have a synagogue meant there was a place where the youth could grow up and be respected for their convictions. The kind of youth that would not love God, would not care about being spiritually minded, would not be at the synagogue. But those who were would be respected by the individuals who made it up. This was a kind of a haven for those who really wanted to develop into true servants of the Lord. There was the opportunity to learn the law. It's so hard for us to comprehend a time when there were not Bibles in every home. But actually, every Bible, if you please, every book of the Bible had to be copied by hand And that just meant that it would be a very expensive thing, each one. And the people were poor, and so they couldn't have copies of every book of the Old Testament. Many perhaps had no book at all. But in the synagogue, there was a collection of the books, and these books were read every Sabbath day, as James observed in Acts 15. And people could be there and hear the reading of the law of God, rather lengthy readings. And then in addition, they would be encouraged to morality. These synagogues could exercise discipline. In fact, they could give beatings if they chose. And Jesus said that some of his disciples would be beaten in the synagogues because of opposition to what they were teaching and preaching about Jesus. But this discipline would certainly contribute to the morality of the community. And it would give a young person opportunity to develop as a teacher. For if he showed some kind of talent, he would be used for that purpose. Seeing all of this, it's not surprising that soon after Jesus began his ministry, he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He took advantage of the synagogue and must have been well known there because it was his custom to be there when he lived in that particular city. The end of the temple was predicted. And it was predicted not only in the book of Matthew, but I'm especially interested in what we have in the book of John. We have in the 4th chapter of John a journey that Jesus made through Samaria. And the disciples left to go find something to eat. And while they were gone, Jesus sat down by a well and had a conversation with a Samaritan woman. We're not going into all the details of that. The whole story is so interesting. But there was a great controversy between the Samaritans and the Jews as to where the temple should be. The Jews, of course, had their temple in Jerusalem, but the Samaritans had built one on Mount Gerizim, and they insisted that that was the place where the temple should be. As soon as this woman at the well discovered that Jesus was a prophet, she wanted to bring up this old question: where's the place to worship? Should you worship in Jerusalem or where our fathers worshiped? Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father." He did tell her that Jerusalem was the place God had designed, but he says the hour is coming when that's not going to matter. The hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. What is meant by this spirit and truth? That's where the line should be. What is meant by the idea of worshiping in spirit and truth? I think the explanation I've heard most often has been that it is to be with the heart, that is with the spirit. We're to be thinking about what we're doing. And it's also to be according to the scriptures, according to what the law of the Lord requires. That's true. There's no question about that. But that's nothing new. Jesus said there's a change coming when true worshipers will worship in spirit and truth. Always, all through the Old Testament, people had been expected to worship the Lord with their heart and to worship the Lord according to the teaching of the law. When the two priests violated the rules of worship, they suffered seriously. And of course, in other times, when there were changes in the way people sought even to worship God, God was displeased. No, always, all through the Old Testament as well as the New, it's true that there needs to be a heart involvement as well as teaching, acting according to the Scriptures. I don't really believe that's what's emphasized here. I believe the idea of spirit perhaps does involve this matter of the heart, but truth must mean the true spirit, true worship, in contrast with shadow worship. The temple and the Jerusalem and those things that pertain to the temple were all shadows. Turn with me to the 10th chapter of the book of Hebrews. All of you are familiar, I suppose, with that. But in the verses 1 and 2, the law having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with these same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. If I put my hand over here, you can see that there is a shadow on the back. I don't know if you can see it or not. My hand is the real thing. The shadow is back there on the wall. Now the shadow is like my hand. You can see how many fingers I have, but that's not my hand. That's the shadow. Now, what Hebrews is saying is that the temple and the sacrifices and the city of Jerusalem were all a shadow. They were like the real thing, but they were not the real thing. The real thing were the things that were involved in Christ's coming and in the new dispensation. And that's why he says the old is passing away, the shadow is passing, but the new, the real is coming. The shadow can be seen with the physical eye. It's material, it's tangible, but the real is not seen with the eye. It's by faith that we recognize those realities. Let's look then at Jerusalem, for example. Jerusalem was a shadow of the heavenly Jerusalem. In the 12th chapter of Hebrews, verses 22 and 23, this emphasis is given. Here, beginning with verse 22, he says, "You have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem." You're not concerned, this is the change. The old earthly Jerusalem was what was important under the old covenant, but we have come to the heavenly Jerusalem under the new covenant, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. And that ornate building actually is a type of the high priest. Well, I want to go back and get that. That ornate building was actually a shadow of heavenly things. In the 8th chapter of the book of Hebrews, verses 1 and 2, now this is the main point of the things we're saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a ministry of the sanctuary and the true tabernacle. You've even got the word true there. The true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. That tabernacle where the priest served under the law was a shadow, but the true tabernacle is actually heaven itself. The same thing is suggested in chapter 9 and verse 24. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Of course, we could actually spend an entire lesson just showing something about what these shadows actually represented, but I think you're familiar with most of them. And I'm just going to suggest, of course, that the high priest is Jesus Christ. I believe the holy garments are the righteous acts of the saints. The animal sacrifices were but a shadow of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. The incense was the prayers of the saints, Revelation 5. The candlestick, and I'm not as sure of this one, but I think it may be the Word of God. The laver was the likeness of baptism. Instrumental music, I believe, is replaced with a harp. In Ephesians 5:19, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody, not on a trumpet, not with a harp, but in the heart unto the Lord. And finally, holy water may very well refer to the word by which we are cleansed. Jesus said, now you are clean by the words that I've spoken unto you. Well, you might disagree with about some of those, but the point I'm making is that when Jesus said that the old is passing away, everything about Jerusalem, the temple, the priesthood, all of that's passing away. Those things are but shadows of the real thing which Jesus was introducing himself. Actually, that old temple was destroyed in AD 70, never to be rebuilt. I know when I was a boy, I had a picture of the temple with a big dome. I'd seen enough pictures of Jerusalem to know exactly what the temple looked like. But that's really the Dome of the Rock, which has been built by the Arabs, the Muslims. And the old temple was not like that. The old temple was destroyed and never was rebuilt and never will be. It would be impossible to restore the sacrifices, even to restore the priesthood that existed in that time since the destruction of the temple and all the records that were contained within it. What was to take its place? Well, I believe that when Jesus said, I will build my church, that's what would take its place. Paul wrote to the church in Corinth and said, the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. And Peter speaks about being built up as living stones as a temple to the Lord. So it's not the old temple, it's the new one. Local churches are not like the temple. Local churches are like the synagogue. There are many of them. In any community where there are saints, you have a local assembly. And they can build a building if they wish, but it's not the building, it's the people that really are the church. And each one is independent and autonomous if the New Testament is followed as it should be, so that there is local control in every instance. In addition to that, buildings that are built should be built just for the purpose of meeting and to serve the function of teaching, and not elaborate buildings that minister to pride. The church, according to the New Testament, has elders and deacons, Philippians 1 and verse 1. There are no holy garments that separate one group of Christians from another group. There is nothing specified at all. No animal sacrifices, no incense. There's Bible reading, and there's comments on the Bible, and there are no instruments of music, and certainly there is no holy water. You can see the comparison then between the church and the synagogue. In fact, James, in the 2nd chapter, actually uses the word synagogue in the original language. It's translated assembly, but in the original language, it was synagogue. So much comparison, so much alike, that if both words mean the same, then he could use one as well as the other. Participation in a local congregation offers some of the very same benefits as those that were offered by the synagogue. There's the opportunity for young men and young women to be appreciated for the qualities that they possess. There are opportunities to hear the law and to hear it proclaimed and taught. There are opportunities for young men to develop themselves in teaching. And it's Jesus involved himself with the synagogue. It certainly makes sense that we should involve ourselves fully, as we tried to emphasize last night, in the affairs of a local congregation. I want to conclude with 3 very important lessons that I think grow out of what we have said. The first of these is something that is very significant, I think. The New Testament prophesies an apostasy or a falling away or a departure from the truth. We're not going to looking at those passages. Doubtless you're aware of them. Paul said in Acts 20, verse 28, that even from among the elders of the Ephesus church, men would rise speaking perverse things and draw away disciples. Paul in 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter, 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, describes it. 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, there'd be a falling away would come before the return of the Lord. So it was not a surprise that very soon after the apostles died, changes began to be made in the church. And it's really interesting how many of those changes actually went back to, reverted to the temple, went back to the characteristics of the temple. Apostasy added a central headquarters. The temple was the center for Judaism all over the world. And before very long, there was a movement to have one great cathedral that was the center cathedral for all the churches in all the world. In addition to that, the buildings became more and more ornate and were built as expensively as possible. And you wonder sometimes how the poor people could possibly have been able to finance the kinds of buildings that were built all over Europe particularly. I saw in one cathedral in Europe a picture of a king, and he had a small model of the temple or the cathedral itself, and he was offering that to God as though a building was what God was looking for. God's not looking for a building. I believe that an assembly of Christians have a right to build a building that accommodates their needs for doing what the Lord's told them to do, but something to minister to pride or something to minister to their social life is not something the Lord has ordained. A clergy-laity distinction began to be made quickly, so that there were priests and there were laity or laymen, a difference. And vestments were then determined for the clergy so that they would wear special clothes, collar turned around in the lower levels, but much more ornate clothing in the higher levels. Transubstantiation is a revival of animal sacrifices. The idea is that the body and blood of Christ actually are what the bread and fruit of the vine become, so that when you take the bread into your mouth, you're sacrificing again the body of Jesus Christ. Incense was restored to worship. And if you see the service of some of the religious groups on television, they're going to be scattering incense all around. Where did it come from? Not from the synagogue. It came from the temple, and not from the New Testament either, I might mention. What about candles and baptismal fonts for sprinkling? Not for immersion, but for sprinkling. And instrumental music, and of course even holy water. These always appeal to the flesh. Everything about the temple, as we said before, was something you could see, or something you could smell, or something you could hear, or even something you could touch, as they touched the animals that were being put to death. But the new is a matter of faith. It's not something that appeals to the senses, but something that appeals to the soul. A second thing we've already touched on, Jesus customarily attended and participated in synagogue worship, and I believe it's in order that we all take advantage to the very fullest degree of what local congregations can offer in the way of instruction and encouragement in righteousness, helping and assisting one another as family, as we indicated last night. But the third thing I want to emphasize is this, that Jesus did not allow one bitter experience to hinder him from attending other synagogues. In the 4th chapter of the book of Luke, when Jesus came back to his hometown, he went into the synagogue. And at first, his reception was good. They even let him take the book of the law and read it and make comments on it. But sadly enough, they, after receiving it so well, became distressed about what he said. He saw they were rejecting him, and he compared them to the day when Elijah had to go to a foreign country to be cared for in a time of famine. And then when he said these things are fulfilled in your hearing, words that had actually appeared to the Messiah, they recognized the claims he was making, and they were incensed by it. And they actually took him out of the building and tried to push him over a cliff. And I think miraculously he escaped from their hands. They tried to kill him. What would be your reaction? I think many of us would say, "Oh, I'm finished with synagogues. No more synagogue for me." That's what some people do when they have what they consider an unpleasant experience in a congregation. They say, "Well, no more Church of Christ for me." Don't you realize that each congregation is different? If one did mistreat, and sometimes churches can mistreat individuals. 3 John tells about this matter, Diotrephes, who threw people out of the church. If you were thrown out by Diotrephes, were you finished with the Church of Christ forever? Or did you realize that was simply a circumstance in that particular location which did not necessarily represent what's characteristic of other churches of Christ? We need to learn that. And Jesus learned it. Jesus didn't wash his hands of synagogues. In fact, you go right in that same chapter, and Luke tells us that he went through all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues. He wasn't finished with synagogues. And Stephen disputed in the synagogue in Jerusalem. And Jesus, and Acts 17 says that Paul, as his custom was, went into the synagogue when he got into Thessalonica. That's where they first began to preach in most every community where there was a synagogue. We need to understand that local churches are independent, and that one does not necessarily represent what another may be doing. The weaknesses of one do not necessarily represent the weaknesses of others. Even so, the strengths of some do not mean that others are strong. They're independent, and that's something for us to remember. Well, that's what I wanted to talk about tonight, and I hope it's been profitable for you. I hope that we can learn the lessons and stick to the Scriptures. If we stick to the Scriptures, we make that change that Jesus predicted for the woman at the well, and we live under the new covenant where the promises and where the blessings are greater. Someone was mentioning just a day or two ago that the key word of the book of Hebrews is better. Everything about the new covenant is better. And how foolish for us to go back to the shadows and types of the old covenant and think that somehow or other we're going forward. That's going backwards, and we don't want to do that. We want to go forward to the Lord. If there's one here tonight who's not a Christian and you'd like to encourage you to obey the Lord, we are not asking you to join us. We're asking you to join the Lord, to follow him. I've decided to follow Jesus, we sang. And if this congregation is following Jesus, after you've been baptized into Christ, you'd like to worship with them, that would be appropriate. But if they cease to follow Jesus, find another congregation that is following. And if you can't find one, start one, using the seed of the kingdom and planting it in the hearts of others and letting it bear its own fruit. We stand and sing to encourage you.